Welcome to the Brainfluence Podcast with Roger Dooley, author, speaker, and educator on neuromarketing and the psychology of persuasion. Every week, we talk with thought leaders that will help you improve your influence with factual evidence and concrete research. Introducing your host, Roger Dooley.
Welcome to the Brainfluence Podcast. I'm Roger Dooley. Our guest this week has an interesting past. He's worked as a biologist, a rock climbing guide, an environmental consultant, and an environmental educator. Today he's a science writer, but even there he's taken a different path by focusing on the human element. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Nature, Scientific American, Harper's, and National Geographic. His new book is Suggestible You, The Curious Science of Your Brain's Ability to Deceive, Transform, and Heal. Welcome to the show, Erik Vance.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, Erik, you're joining us today from Mexico City, right? How's the traffic these days?
Oh, the traffic's a lot better than it used to be. It's gotten a lot better. But now we have bikes and we've got metros. We got all kinds of stuff.
Well, that's good. I lived there many years ago, and boy, it was brutal. But I'm glad to hear it's improving, and hopefully the smog situation's improved a little bit too.
Yeah, it's as we say in Mexico, poco a poco. Little bit by little bit, I think we're getting better, but there's a lot more here than just smog. There's, as you know,
it's a beautiful city though. Yeah, the food, and I love the people in Mexico City too. I mean, and just when I was living there, they were always very welcoming. When I tried to speak Spanish, even poorly, they would be happy to help out, and they enjoyed the fact that I was at least making the attempt. So anyway, this book, Suggestible You, is really interesting because it really parallels a lot of the stuff that I've written about. In fact, we both write about some of the same research, although perhaps from a little bit different perspective. And the common theme is the power of expectations. You talk about the individual humans being sort of their brains are expectation generators. And if you can set those expectations, you can actually change reality for those people. And obviously, when you're talking about placebos in a medical sense, that's true. It's true for marketers as well. And one of the things we both wrote about were the wine studies that show that what you expect from a wine sets your expectations, and give people a taste of an inexpensive wine like $2 Chuck and tell them it's a $50 wine, and they'll experience a much better wine than if they think it's a $5 wine.
It's interesting you bring that up, and there's sort of been a sea change over the last decade or so, and I'm sure you know about this. I talk a lot in the book about medicine, but I think it's a lot of it applies to marketing. We're going to understand how it applies to sort of our perceptions in the everyday world as well as we learn more about this. But there's sort of been a sea change from whether it's a medical thing or whether it's tasting wine. We once thought that, if you thought that a wine tasted better, if you thought that you were feeling better, it was just sort of something you were telling yourself or something that wasn't true, but you were kind of convincing yourself it might be true. But what we've found is that certainly in the case of medicine and presumably in the case of tasting wine, you actually are experiencing these things. These things are real. You literally are, in the case of medicine, healing yourself. And in the case of wine, the assumption today is that it does actually taste better. You're actually having a better experience because of your expectation, which is really wild when you start to try to wrap your head around that. The fact that your body can just make that so.
Well, yeah, in the case of wine, they've demonstrated that with fMRI, where they show that the areas associated with pleasure light up more when people think they're drinking a $50 wine. So, as you say, it's not just sort of an verbal adaptation that, this is a $50 wine, so I better say good things about it. Their brains are actually experiencing that better wine. And of course, the documented placebo work shows the remarkable power of these expectations.
In the case of pain relief, I talk a lot about mind's ability to release endogenous opioids, it's basically morphine-like chemicals that the brain releases into itself as a way to essentially medicate itself. They call it the internal pharmacy. I'm actually very curious to know what the analog would be for the wine drinking. I mean, you mentioned the fMRI studies, but what does that actually mean? But these are real chemicals. These are things you can measure, and they're not just, wishful thinking or something like that. This is measurable effects. And that's, I think, one of the things that once you wrap your brain around it, this whole world just kind of opens up.
So, Erik, you tell the remarkable story about a surgeon who became a homeopath and was really successful at that, but then totally reversed gears and abandoned that practice and is actually arguing against homeopathy now. Can you explain about that? I mean, that seemed like such a strange sequence of events.
Well, it's a really interesting story. Natalie Grams is her name, and she works in Germany where homeopathy was created. And she was sort of a standard young doctor, who was introduced into this world of quick turnaround for patients and constant pressure to move on to the next patient, see a patient as a group of symptoms. And I think it was really unfulfilling to her. And it wasn't until she had a car accident that caused her some pretty debilitating symptoms afterwards related to sort of post-traumatic issues that she discovered. After trying lots and lots of different medications, she discovered homeopathy. And she got so into it that she actually became a homeopath herself and ended up proselytizing for this thing that she really believed was helping people. And she decided to write.
We should probably explain what homeopathy is, just
Of course. No, of course. So homeopathy is sort of this alternative form of healthcare that involves, I guess you could say, like curing like. It's sort of a whole separate set of logics that most of it involves taking some sort of chemical and diluting it down to the point where there's literally nothing left in the dilution anymore. It's basically just water. And there's no scientific evidence that it works or that it has an effect beyond placebo. So she became a real booster for homeopathy, and it really struggles to get respect in the field of medicine. And so she decided to write a book about homeopathy and how effective it was. And through the course of writing this book, she realized that actually it wasn't any more effective than placebos, and which is, a lot of scientists have shown this again and again. And so she ended up writing this book sort of condemning homeopathy and got sort of stuck in the middle. And what's interesting about that isn't necessarily, scientists were right or homeopaths were right. My question is, well, then in that case, what's the placebo effect? If this thing helps millions of people around the world and it's basically run through the placebo effect. She tells one story about she was prescribing melted snow to one of her patients. Well, melted snow is water, literally water. And if you can prescribe water to people and have them get better, this saved this patient's life pretty much, who was trapped in her house and couldn't leave, then what is that effect? Let's lay aside whether or not, there's some sort of magical property to homeopathic remedies. What's the placebo effect? That's really sort of, I try to kick off the book from that perspective of, let's put aside, what's real medicine and what's not. Let's talk about how these quote unquote not real medicines operate in the brain. And what's interesting is it led me down this massive rabbit hole and into the jungles of Mexico and in the streets of Beijing and all over the place. And just as with your tasting of wines, it turns out that your expectation, your beliefs can trigger real effects in the body. And that's a measurable phenomenon. And that's what's amazing about all of this.
One thing I found interesting, Erik, in parallel to marketing, was Dr. Graham's conclusion that what made homeopathy work was the story associated with the treatment. And so the melting snow was a story rather than giving somebody a glass of water. And of course, you pick up just about any marketing text these days, and it'll tell you the importance of story, both to engage the reader's brain and to be persuasive. And that's echoing exactly here in the effectiveness of placebos. They work best when there's a story attached to them.
Yeah, and the storytelling element of this is so important. It's a big part of, I don't just talk about placebos in the book. I also go into hypnosis and false memories and what all these things share. They all share some element of expectation, but they also share this storytelling. And that is such a big part of how we generate expectations in our brains. We are storytelling creatures. This is who we are. This is what we do. And a big part of the way that we can access these beliefs is by telling a story. And that story, it could be something like, I'm going to give you this pill. It'll go into your brain. It'll spread all of, it'll cause soothing experience in your brain. My favorite example of this is your average pharmaceutical commercial that says, you know, they have these pictures of someone like red on fire and they take something and it like cools off and becomes blue. Well, that's a story you're telling. It's a very simple story, but it's a story you're telling. Or it could be something like, you know, the complex story of marketing, you know, that goes into marketing a can of Coca-Cola, you know, and what Coca-Cola means versus Pepsi. And these are all sort of the stories that we tell ourselves about what's going on around us. This is how we make sense of the world. And it's wild to see how this can affect your body when that story becomes so real that it almost has to be true.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the other element that you see popping up in multiple places is sort of the theatrical aspect, starting with maybe Franz Mesmer, who came with his mesmerism is named for him. He had this great story about magnetism, and in effect what he was doing was hypnotizing people perhaps, but you described the shirt he wore that was leather and lined with magnets, and that made him no doubt much more convincing and effective than what he was doing.
Mesmer was the master of these things. He was this sort of odd 18th century character who is a doctor who believed that the world sort of ran on magnetism, that you know, the planets moved through magnetism and the tides moved through magnetism. We know today that this isn't true. Gravity and a whole host of other forces are at work there. But he also thought this magnetism could sort of be controlled by his mind, and so he created this whole, it's almost like homeopathy. It was a whole external logic, this whole thing that seemed to work with itself, but only with itself. And he had this wonderful parlor where you'd go in and he'd play weird music and turn on the lights. And he had this like crazy clothing, and he was very aware of the power that storytelling and that the theater can have on our expectations. And he had Paris kind of in the palm of his hands for many years. The high society would come and get healed from all kinds of different maladies, including Marie Antoinette, who I think probably triggered his eventual downfall, which came with an investigation from the king, Marie Antoinette's husband. It was actually led by none other than Benjamin Franklin, who sort of debunked all this. But there's still this, you know, he had tapped into this amazing ability of our brains to take an expectation and basically force it to meet reality, you know, and that's what we're talking about. You're talking about you create an expectation, and when that doesn't work out, your brain steps in and makes that into reality. And that's what he was doing.
I think there's a parallel, too. Later in the book, you talk about a stage hypnotist who parks his Rolls Royce in front of the theater, mm-hmm. and then also ensures, even by giving away tickets if necessary, that the theater itself is packed. And so you've got a couple of things going on there. First of all, you've got this ostentatious show of wealth that immediately implies that, okay, this person must be for real. They must be really good at what they're doing. And then there's the classic marketing principle of social proof when there's a whole big crowd there. So again, this must be good because everybody is here and they're watching this.
There's two sort of key elements that, as Andrew Newton, who taps into those things, he was a fascinating interview and a really interesting guy. He thinks a lot about these issues. And what he does is he also relies heavily on the power of peer pressure to affect what we, you know, some of the people he hypnotizes, you know, aren't really even hypnotized. And if they are, he often says it starts with, you know, when they walk in and they see he did this before in the old days, they see his car out front and they think, you know, they'd start creating expectation that they would become hypnotized. And then they sit down in the theater and everyone around them is making all this, you know, noise, and you know, and they see all the people in the theater and they create more of an expectation. And then it's both the power of suggestibility, but also the power of the peer pressure of being in a group. We're very social animals. And what more recent science has found is that this also plays a big role in placebo effects, that if you can convince someone that other people have had certain relief from a given placebo trigger, you know, whether it be a pill or even just rating a certain kind of pain. When you see other people's ratings of that pain, it not only affects what you think you're experiencing, it basically affects what your body literally experiences. So if everyone else calls this, you know, not very painful, you will rate it the same way, even if those people aren't real, even if they're just made up by the scientists. But if you think other people have said this wasn't painful, you will both say it's not painful and your body will register it that way, as if it isn't painful. You're basically killing that pain through your expectation and through the peer pressure. And this is very new and very exciting because it's sort of our social lives sort of made real in our bodies. It's a very, very interesting piece of research.
Yeah, and I think the parallel to marketing there is perfect too, because if simply seeing these elements of what a marketer might call social proof that, okay, this worked for other people 90% of the time or something like that, that if that can produce changes in a person's physiology, then that can also work for marketers' purposes. Obviously, this has to be done in an ethical way. You can't make up stuff as a placebo researcher might just to see what happens. But if you can use these things like either testimonials or other indications of success from customers in an honest and ethical way, they can be extremely effective. One thing that I was kind of amazed by, you're sort of a human crash test dummy for various types of suggestibility research. I never met a placebo that you didn't like, I guess. A couple of things that you did in Mexico where you actually saw a couple of brujos, which would translate into either male witch or witch doctor. One was a more modern one to help you with some pain relief, but the other was to see if he could curse you. So why don't you explain about those? And then I guess the curse wasn't too effective since we're talking here today.
Yeah.
Or not fatal anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, actually. We'll get to that in a second. I mean, no one understands this stuff better than shamans and witch doctors around the world. I mean, this is something that we've been doing for a very long time as humans, and it's something that we tap into all the time. And so I found the shamans to be very adept at tapping into belief and into the stage, like the theater that we were talking about. And what's interesting is in that former case is how much that theater had changed over the years. And this is a place that was famous for its brujos. And in the past, those would have been sort of these elaborate sort of dancing, fire breathing, sort of crazy performances. And now they're very much just, they look like doctors. Now they wear white coats and they have, it's all very anesthetic, and they have little, plastic squirt bottles, and they're very, it's all very clinical looking. And that's because our expectations of where healing happens and how it happens has changed. And it's happened in this little village too, because there are modern hospitals there now. And so the brujos have changed too. And if you go into a homeopath's office, it's both comforting, but it's also, it's reminiscent of a doctor's experience, sort of the way a doctor maybe should be, and this is sort of tapping into all of these expectations that we all carry around with us. So yeah, that one was fun. But then, I got to this chapter on nocebos, which is sort of the anti-placebo. Placebos are an expectation of something good happening. Nocebo is an expectation of something bad happening, and that covers superstition and curses. But what's interesting about nocebos is not a lot of research has been done. I had 3 chapters on placebos, and placebos, there just wasn't much that had been done with it. And if you think about it, it makes some sense, because it's very hard to study a nocebo. You can't go in and make someone sicker, with suggestions. It's not right. It's not ethical to go in and tell someone with depression that this pill will make it worse, or someone with Parkinson's tell them that this pill will make it worse. And I haven't seen a lot of it in marketing literature either. How do you make something taste worse, or some experience worse?
There's not usually a big demand for that.
No. Why would you want to do that? So it's a bit of a question mark. So I ended up,
unless you could do it to your competitor, I guess.
You could just, actually, that does make some sense. But so I ended up having to sort of go on my own and explore this on my own. And what I ended up finding out, I found out a lot of interesting things about curses and superstition. And then I ended up getting myself cursed just on a lark. And it's a surprisingly easy thing to do. You just have to write a name on a piece of paper. Obviously, it's not very involved, because you'd never be able to sign someone up to come down and get cursed if there was a big process involved. And I was interested in how I would respond. I didn't expect a piano to fall on me or something like that, but I did expect my own perception, my own brain to respond. And maybe I get sick or something like that. And you have to read the book to find out what happens. But it was definitely not what I was expecting. Something did happen, and it was not at all what I thought was going to happen.
Yeah, that is really a great story. I guess also in that case, the cursed person really, for it to be effective, would have to know about it. In other words, they'd have to be informed, because if it's a nocebo effect, I mean, assuming it's not really a truly supernatural effect that is going to happen remotely where the person isn't aware of it and suddenly falls down a flight of stairs, not only do you have to have a plausible brujo or somebody enact the curse for you, but then you have to inform the victim that they've been cursed.
Well, that's the other thing is there's some debate among the brujos that I talked to about this, but most people say that you have to tell someone they're cursed in order for the curse to work. You have to inform them. I did talk to one brujo who said, she was so powerful that you didn't need to do
not
that.
necessary.
Yeah, not necessary for her, but most of them agreed. You need to tell them that they're cursed, which says something right there.
Those other less effective ones, you have to tell them.
Yeah, that was kind of her point.
I found a kind of an interesting parallel between the field of neuromarketing and placebo research, because for years, I started writing about neuromarketing a dozen years ago, and probably for the first 5+ years that I was writing about it, talking to academics about it, you might as well be talking about parapsychology or flying saucers or something. I mean, they really want no part of it. They considered it pseudoscience. Even I think as recently as 5 years ago, 50 eminent neuroscientists wrote a letter to the New York Times basically trying to debunk a neuromarketing article that had been written by Martin Lindstrom. But now finally the corner has been turned. There's been a big comprehensive study at Temple University that got published. And now we're seeing other universities, both in Europe and the United States, picking up on the field. And it's becoming academically acceptable to talk about and do research on. And really, placebo research almost followed that same kind of arc, right?
Yeah, that's 20 years ago, you would have gotten a very similar response if you had told people you studied placebos. And it was sort of this sort of fringy, one placebo scientist called it sort of flaky thing. And I have a lot of respect for the scientists who really stuck in there, hung in there, and going back to the 70s and even before, really, sort of at their own peril, their own career peril, just pursued these questions and wanted to know what was going on. How can you have, based on taking the sugar pill, how can someone get better? It's a haunting question. And with the advent of neuroimaging, I think in some of the technologies we now have, it's given the scientists an opportunity to show what many of them already knew, which is that these are measurable, real effects in the body, and that you're actually tapping into actual chemicals, and that you can see it. And so that has, I think, really opened when I went to a placebo conference a couple of years ago, and almost everyone there, they were neurologists, neuroscientists, they were young, they were really interested in brain mechanics, and not in sociology, not in psychology or belief. They really want to know how the brain works. And this is a great way to look at that. And it's the same thing on the marketing side and also in hypnosis, which is still largely overlooked and derided. But these are real effects, and it's a great window into the brain. And I think now, as a young scientist, you can go into both of these fields and not be
laughed at least.
Yeah.
Just the concept of a placebo conference sounds kind of amusing for some reason. It's like, do you want to go to a real conference or a placebo conference?
Yeah, all the people in the audience were all cardboard cutouts, which was disappointing. But no, it's in fact, I would say it's even more than that. Like, I think a lot of the scientists who I've talked to going in both of these fields they're looking for blue sky kind of stuff. They're looking for open areas that haven't been investigated, and there's so many questions. I mean, I came up with probably 10 different potential PhD theses during the course of writing this book that no one's looked at. No one's answered these questions. That just shows like how much room there is, how many questions we have unanswered that I can't wait to see. I think in the next few years or decades, we're just going to get so much great stuff out of these fields, and how expectation affects not just our mind, but our bodies. Mm-hmm. And from everything what's interesting is it's all very cutting edge. There's some really interesting science into how your expectation affects your products you buy, how you see those products, and how you interact with those products. But this and it sounds very new, but this goes back thousands of years. Like this is something that's so familiar to us. I don't know if you feel like that when you did this.
Yeah, I do. And I think it's exciting that there is this unexplored territory, because in so many areas of scientific endeavor, the basic work has been done. And now you're faced with really a little stuff around the fringe that is either of no consequence or requires massive amounts of money to explore. Like there's still room for work in particle physics, but it's something that's pretty hard for most folks to do.
Well, and there's a lot, but for those topics or for cancer research, like there's a lot to learn, but not by me. Like I can't come up with a really good question that hasn't been answered by cancer scientists. Like maybe I could after 4 years of study, but in this field, it's just there's so much open, and these aren't small things. These are huge effects in the body that really and they're it's also a multi-billion-dollar problem, by the way, for the pharmaceutical industry. Belief and expectation causes billions of dollars of failed trials every year in that industry. So this is not little stuff. This is big stuff.
Yeah, I remember I heard Andrew Weil, the doctor who focuses a lot on alternative medicine, speak once, and he was talking about the placebo effect and said that his friends who were medical researchers found the placebo effect endlessly annoying because it screwed up their research into the effectiveness of their drugs. And his comment to them was, well, maybe you ought to look at figuring out how to make the placebo effect a little bit more effective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, of course, there's this weird line that I haven't really come to terms with myself between, when it's okay to use the placebo effect and when are you lying to your patients? When are you lying to your customers? And we have this, I often say that in our society, and I don't know why this is, that we think it's okay. We forgive someone who uses a placebo effect, and if that's something that you do and that helps you, fine. But we have a tough time with people who sell placebos. And I never really got comfortable. Andrew Weil obviously promotes a lot of different placebos, and I never really came to terms with how I saw that. Like, should we be bolstering the placebo effect? Should we be focusing on a placebo effect in addition to these drugs? And what about the people who make a living on placebos? It's
right. And it is a tough line, because on the one hand, it may be effective, and you've got to have that story to go with it that, okay, this is an extract from the whatever plant, and have a great story, but the story is totally bogus. Then, what are the ethics of that, even if it's effective? So yeah, it's complicated. Yeah. Let me jump over to, somebody. I'm guessing that most of our audience members have heard of motivation expert Tony Robbins. And, in the book, you say that he's actually practicing a form of hypnosis in his stage presentations, and pretty much the same thing for folks like TV evangelists and even rock bands. What do you mean? How is Tony Robbins or any of these other folks, how are they performing hypnosis in effect?
I should say that, just like the placebos were a number of years ago, hypnosis just hasn't been studied enough. And mass hypnosis is even less. I think it's one of these things that so many questions that just I couldn't get answered. So this actually came from that stage hypnotist who it was more from his experience. And I would love to see someone study this. But as a stage hypnotist, what you do is you have to get people acting as a group. And so best way to do it is you stand up and say, okay, why don't you everyone stand up, give a hand to the band, everyone, aren't they great? Okay, everyone clap again. Now have a seat. Okay, now raise your hand if you do this or this, and now, okay, put your hands down. And what he's doing is he's doing two things. He's getting people to act as a group. Unconsciously, they're acting as a group, they're standing up, they're raising their hand. He's getting people to follow his instructions. And for a stage hypnotist, these two things are key. You have to be able to sort of create authority in yourself, an expectation that you're going to make all these changes in these folks. And you have to get them acting together so they can get that peer pressure affecting them. And this hypnotist had seen some of Tony Robbins' work, and he sees, and if you ever go, the exact same process is involved there. Everyone, hug the person next to you, not turn around and hug the person next to you, stop five the person next to you, and sit down, now get up and stretch, it's a lot of that same methodology. And it's the same thing you see in even in churches and in a lot of group rituals that have gone on for thousands of years in various parts of the world. I looked at, some of the earliest gatherings of human beings in the New World, at least, were these sort of religious group ceremonies. And so it's not hypnosis in the sort of spiral eyeball, sort of TV kind of mind control. It's making people suggestible, prepping them for suggestions that may be positive, maybe negative, but this is how you can get that started. It's as old as we are, and it's just as useful today as it was back then.
Might have to try that in my next speech. Well, we'll see. So it's probably a good place to break off, Erik. Let me remind our listeners that we're speaking with Erik Vance, author of the new book, Suggestible You, The Curious Science of Your Brain's Ability to Deceive, Transform, and Heal. I think the marketers in our audience will find it really interesting, not just from the standpoint of the remarkable physical changes that these suggestion effects can cause, but also that human reality is shaped by expectations, and it's the job of marketers to create those expectations, hopefully in an appropriate and ethical way. Erik, how can our listeners find you and your stuff online?
Oh, well, the easiest way to find me is probably suggestibleyou.com. My old work, you can find at erikvance.com. But, if you want to reach out to me, if you've heard something today that's interesting, the best way to get me is on Twitter at erikvance.com. That's ERIK, V as in Victor, ANCE.com. I'd love to hear from people and experiences they've had with marketing placebos and physical placebos.
Great. Well, we will link to those places, to your book, and any other resources we spoke about on the show notes page at rogerdooley.com/podcast. Erik, thanks so much for being on the show. Really enjoyed the book.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. This is great.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Brainfluence Podcast. To continue the discussion and to find your own path to brainy success, please visit us at rogerdooley.com.